It's a great pleasure to welcome you to Session 10, Networks Institutions. I'd like to thank both Roland and Taylor for putting this together and inviting me to chair this panel. We're going to be discussing networks institutions, which I think are two of the most pressing issues if we look at Canada's interest moving ahead in the next 20 years in dealing with grand strategies. And we have four very different and accomplished speakers on our panel that will give very different backgrounds and important insight to how Canada can move forward. We're going to start off, starting from my left, Yves Tiberghien, who's a director of the Institute of Asian Research and Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of British Columbia. Be followed by Mark Raymond, who's a research fellow in the Internet Governance Project at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Followed by Maurice Rosenberg, who's a former Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and the incoming President of the Trudeau Foundation. Followed by Farah Faisal-Thaler, who's Associate Director of the International Institutions and Global Governance at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. So I'd like to start off and invite Yves to give his presentation.
Merci. D'abord, je tiens à remercier Roland et Taylor pour cette invitation. C'est un grand honneur d'être ici. Et bien que je sois, je crois, le seul représentant de Vancouver et spécialiste sur l'Asie, on parle aussi français donc à Vancouver et j'en profite pour saluer tous les francophones. So I'm actually talking about something that really tags well with Robert Greenhill, also Paul Heinbaker, and Alish Campbell, that is about some systemic change. But I will narrow it down to say that we actually probably have a critical juncture at the moment and maybe a critical decade. And so if we don't do a bunch of things during that decade, the world after that decade will be very, very different. And so that will focus a little more. The big point here is that we are entering a period, or we have entered a period of non-linear change, where we'll have critical disjunctures. There is massive change of an order that's much greater than anything we have seen since in a post-war period. So we are living through a change in history. And so that calls for something of a higher order than just business as usual. And the question for Canada is, will Canada work to be at the core of new rising networks and institutions at a time where we have to invent new institutions? We need major creativity. Will Canada be a catalyst in addressing some of the global systemic risks, or rather free ride the currently decaying institutions? And I'm a little provocative here. And I also want to put two examples on the table, two countries that I find particularly proactive now in really spawning networks and trying to upload their own preferences into the global institutional framework are South Korea and Singapore. So I'll get a few lessons from them. But so I'll follow exactly the three parts that were recommended by the organizers. First, describe a bit systemic change, then Canadian vulnerabilities and opportunities, and finally some potential action for Canada. So we live through what I see 5 major trends and changes. The first one is, so it's a bundle of wealth and risk. And in that bundle, first of all, we always celebrate the amazing connectivity, and we recognize that. However, with that connectivity, there is a great paradox. So that the more connected we are, the more we have also removed some of the fuses in the system that would have protected us against contagion or catastrophic cascade effects. So we're much more vulnerable. And when we relive, for example, the events of the 1997 crisis, the Asian crisis, and then the 2008 crisis, it's striking how policymakers confess afterwards how stunned they were by the changes, how stunned they were by the contagion effects that were way beyond what anybody had predicted. So our policy capacity doesn't match today the level of connectivity that we have. And so we have a very vulnerable globalization. And in the paper I cite, economic Nobel Prize winners like Michael Spence, who said essentially we have a great mismatch today between ever-expanding markets and a very slowly expanding governance capacity. And so that creates a graph that goes in opposite direction, or at least the speeds are very different. And so that makes us more vulnerable to any major systemic risk. The second point is that within the global system, apart from the financial system, which is vulnerable, we have an Achilles heel around the energy and commodity markets. And those markets, when you unpack them, you find that actually they're very oligopolistic. Very few of them. Take iron ore, take potash, take a lot of them one after the other, or take oil. They actually are run by oligopole structures. There is very little global governance among them, and the new rising powers that need them so badly don't feel secure in them, and so they try to go around those oligopoles, and that creates a very competitive environment. That's the story of China entering the iron ore market, for example, and it creates ironies. For example, China became the player that led to marketization of the iron ore market and the collapse of the cartel of iron. So there's all kind of interesting things happening, but what we know from history, from the 1930s, is when countries feel insecure about energy and commodity markets, they enter competitive behavior that can destroy those markets. So we have a lot more homework to do on this front. A third point is that we face more and more complex and multifunctional risk or systemic risk. So the Davos, the WEF has a very nice global risk report, and it really highlights the nature of those risks being multifunctional, multidisciplinary, and actually prevalent in a way that we don't have tools to cope with them very well. The ultimate complex risk is climate. They tend to proliferate at the moment. The fourth point is we live through a massive rebalancing of power of a kind that is beyond what we imagine. I'll just want to give a couple examples. When I started teaching at UBC in 2001, the Japanese economy was still 4 times the size of the Chinese economy. And so I used to teach about East Asia political economy, and you had to start with Japan. Today, not only China has passed Japan in 2010, it's already 30% bigger than Japan. But no one before has lived through such change so rapidly, right? So those changes are faster than the capacity of the public to adjust or the policymakers to adjust. If you go to Japan, you'll find out that no policymaker or elite has really adjusted to that or the realization of the changing relation with China. What's also interesting is when I spent a lot of time with policy elites in China or in India, just was back from a long exchange in India, you find that actually we have a window. Those new emerging elites are open for working with us on global governance questions. They recognize the systemic risks around globalization. They recognize systemic risks around climate change. There is more recognition of climate change in China, in Beijing, than often in Washington or in the Congress, for sure. So there is a readiness to engage this. There's a lot of interest in the G20. When I do a spectrum of interest toward the G20, I find that India or China are much more committed or interested than even the US today at this moment, right? And however, this sort of open end that we find at the level of the policy elites is not always welcome on our side. And the critical, it was mentioned yesterday, the critical moment is the ratification of the IMF quota reforms, which is still being blocked by Congress today, when it costs nothing. It's only a transfer, an accounting transfer for the US, and the US keeps all the same voting rights. The voting rights taken away from Europeans, actually, and the board, in the seat board. But the G20 was founded on the compromise, so the Leaders' Summit, between emerging powers and established powers, in which we ask emerging powers to support the global system and buttress it, the trade system, the debt flows, buying in the US debt, etc., in exchange for gradual increase in voice, commensurate with their economic size to the emerging powers. And the non-ratification today in IMF is putting all this in jeopardy. So it's very, very important for the future of G20. That's one thing where every other country should essentially do anything possible to get Congress to ratify. It's the only missing country. So it's an interesting time, and we have that window. Emerging powers that have really taken a big size in a big chunk of the global economy. In 2000, we were still at an economy with about 60% represented by OECD. Today, the OECD is less than 50%, much less already in PPP term. In absolute dollar, it will take a few more years. But all this happened in the last decade. And essentially all future global governance progress will depend on the dialogue between emerging powers, particularly China, India, Indonesia, and the like, and the established powers of the OECD. That's the core axis. That's where there has to be investment. And today we lack the policy networks across those dimensions. They're very thin and far between when it's the primary axis. Finally, when we do the evaluation of current risks, we have to mention that the established institutions that we have are stretched, thin, and tired. So we have spoken a lot about the usefulness of the UN, and I won't say more here. But when it comes to the global economy, much of the action is actually outside the UN. It's the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, the new FSB, the Basel organization, etc. And what we find here, even for development, if I want to add to what John MacArthur said, a big part of development now is being discussed in the G20, but essentially is giving space to emerging countries to pursue policies that give them the sequential or the gradual capacity to enter the global economy. When we study Korea, Korea did not thrive because of aid. It thrived because it had a policy kit that prepared Korea to enter gradually into the global trade system and the global financial system. And often that space is taken away. There's an interesting argument by Ha-Joon Chung, who said we're trying to kick away the ladder from countries when we, before, the US or Europe, actually used a ladder and used all kinds of tools to develop. And it's only later that when we are developed, then we can thrive fully in an open system. So today, the debate around the G20 on capital controls, or smart capital controls, is a key piece of development. And giving that space to country may be necessary. I can mention about this that actually at UBC we're bringing Justin Lin on Monday to UBC. He was the chief economist at the World Bank until last year, and he played a very large role in rethinking the interface between development and global economy. And we're turning this into a very large multi-stakeholder event with 250 guests from the business sector, the government, and the like. So it's an example of interesting innovation on this side. The WTO system is now giving way to a very competitive FTA game. Pascal Lamy, the just departed Director General of the WTO, is calling for caution, saying that we are maybe entering a more fragmented trade system. The international monetary system is totally under-institutionalized, which depend on one currency, but this currency is still run as a national currency, not as a global public good. And so over the next 10 years, we enter a quite delicate period about the monetary system. The IMF and the World Bank need to evolve and represent more the new balance of power. The investment flows are not regulated by any global governance. We basically have bilateral agreements. And in the energy field, the IEA is unable so far to open up to emerging powers because of stickiness of all networks. The G20 is a great idea and was a Canadian idea. And it's actually one, I attend a lot of those G20s as an observer, where there's incredible plasticity, fluidity, and capacity to engage with those new rising powers. But it's underused at the moment by a lot of established powers, including Canada at the moment. So what does it mean for Canada? Canada is incredibly well endowed and positioned for this much more fluid environment, a time of rapid change, rapid risk, fluidity, uncertainty, non-linear change. It's a time where countries have to be nimble, smart, and flexible. But for Canada, there is 4 risks. One is simply the systemic risk of finance and environment and the like, where major disruptors can happen and will reach Canada. Second, Canada as an economic weak positioning on 2 fronts is the resource curse on one hand, we discussed it yesterday, and the old manufacturing base on the other hand. So Canada needs to use the time that it has to move from those 2 positions to a much more nimble, interactive position in the global economy. The fourth is a competitive institutional risk. There are more and more countries, like South Korea, that are using this moment of fluidity to develop webs and to place themselves at the center of institutional arrangements that are being built as we speak. So they try to put themselves as hubs in the global production chain or hubs in the global linkages of the emerging global governance. And so that's an urgent call for Canada to be very proactive in this. And then finally, Canada has this big task, as mentioned, to rebalance toward emerging powers, particularly toward Asia, and away from just the US and European base. And that leads me to a few ideas on Canadian approach in 1 minute. One is Canada can be much more active in the competition for global institutions, particularly in the G20, but way beyond. Nations that do invest in global institutions bear a cost in the short term, but end up having a positional advantage as they upload their own values and their own networks. Second, Canada can do much more with emerging powers. Third, Canada can work much more at the interface with the global economy. Increasingly, the global economy is becoming a political economy. And so there is a need actually for more institutional innovation, both at the global level, at the interface between domestic and global. And the government can do much more and is actually called to do much more. If the Canadian government doesn't feel like doing much more, other countries are, and it gives them a competitive advantage. And finally, the current period calls for a multi-actor, multi-stakeholder partnership, and there are examples of what can happen around universities, policy schools, that can increasingly become platforms and hubs to bring together public sector, private sector, civil society, and all kinds of other players. Essentially, we are at a time where we need a lot of institutional entrepreneurship, lots of innovation, lots of global governance entrepreneurship, and we need to go much beyond what is already happening. Thank you.
First of all, thank you to Taylor and to Roland and to all of the volunteers that have made this terrific conference possible. Thank you for the invitation to take part. I am going to do a little bit more talking about cyber issues, something that's come up in a couple of the sessions so far, yesterday and today. And in the first session, Robert Greenhill told us that we need to think seriously about the fundamentally disruptive nature of the internet for wide swaths of human life. And he was right to do so. What we're living through is a fundamental transformation on the order of the Industrial Revolution. It's producing immense amounts of what Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. But that's not what I want to talk to you about today. These macro trends in technology, as well as the massive global expansion of internet access, which is forever changing the demography of the global internet user base, are important trends. But they're not susceptible to change by policy initiatives undertaken by any single state, let alone a small state like Canada. More important, these major trends have indeterminate consequences for policy. Observing these trends will not get us to the right solutions. Demography is not destiny, and the social implications of any technology depend a great deal on the social uses to which it's put. What I want to suggest instead is that the key political trend that's relevant to internet governance and internet-related public policy issues more generally is the growth in demand for institutional innovation. What we are seeing, what we are watching, what we are undergoing is a complex, high-stakes exercise in rulemaking at the global level. This exercise began in its most recent incarnation, the WICIT, the World Conference on International Telecommunication in Dubai in December 2012, that left the ITU in a fundamentally compromised position. And contrary to the suggestion we heard just before lunch, unfortunately I have to say that I don't think the ITU can play an effective or useful role on this issue, especially on cybersecurity issues. However, rulemaking has continued apace in other venues. So the United Nations Group of Governmental Experts on Cybersecurity concluded last June that the international law of armed conflict does apply online. This is a very important recognition, especially given that Russia, China, and the United States, along with Canada, all participated in that group. Rulemaking is underway in other parts of the UN system as it undergoes the 10-year review of the World Summit on the Information Society. It's underway in ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which is undergoing a strategic review that led in part to the recent Net Mundial meeting in Brazil in April. In the remainder of this talk, I will sketch some insights from social science that should lead us to expect these efforts at rulemaking and institutional innovation will be contentious, complex, and exceedingly difficult. After that, I'll outline some first steps in a possible Canadian strategy for global engagement on cyber issues. The first social science insight points our attention to the increasing incidence of distributional conflict, or conflict over who gets what on and from the internet. These kinds of distributional conflicts are taking place simultaneously at both the domestic and international levels. And as Robert Putnam reminds us, they place governments in the difficult position of striking bargains that balance the interests of parties at both levels. Governments are playing two-level games. Social science also tells us, however, that the severity of distributional conflicts varies by issue area and over time. Some international issues are relatively tractable problems of developing and implementing shared standards. These are coordination problems. Others, however, entail the possibility of exploiting cooperative players to maximize short-term gain, or cooperation issues. Historically, internet governance was a coordination issue, like postal deliveries or like civil aviation. It wasn't controversial, and it was mainly left to technologists and then later to industry players. Recently, though, states have appeared to conclude that the internet is simply too important to be left either to business or to technologists alone. This politicization of a technical issue of global governance is without a clear parallel in the history of the modern international system and deserves much more attention. Independent of these issues of increased distributional conflict, or at least partially independent of them, we have the rapid entry of new players into these governance debates. This raises further difficulties that are well known in social science about the difficulty of reaching agreement and facilitating collective action with large numbers of players. These players are not only states, they're tech firms, but they're also non-tech firms that are impacted by internet issues by virtue of their increasing reliance on information and communications technology. They're also civil society actors of every size and shape. The third problem that I want to highlight stems from complexity and uncertainty. It does so by examining processes of institutional innovation, which are nonlinear, dominated by unintended consequences, and therefore hard to predict. Even the most powerful seldom get everything they want, and even when they get it, they often find that the gains they realize aren't entirely what they had in mind. This problem is exacerbated by uncertainty. In this case, particularly uncertainty about the social implications of new technology. This is an especially pressing problem given that the ministries called to deal with these issues often lack deep technical background that exists in the private sector and elsewhere. What all of this means is that it's hard for players to determine what kind of rule sets and institutions that they want ex ante, whether they will be able to realize their preferred outcomes, and even if they can realize them, whether they will actually yield the desired result. As if this wasn't enough, effective rulemaking is also hampered by conceptual misunderstandings. I'll focus on one here for the interest of time. That's the misunderstanding that the internet is a commons. A large number of players say that it is, including NATO. They're wrong. The internet is eminently excludable, and it's also generally non-rivalrous. What this means in terms of social science is that it's actually a club good, or more accurately, a set of nested clubs. The commons analogy is very useful politically for maintaining open access to a realm we want to exploit, but it misdirects attention to the non-problem of preventing destruction by overuse. No one thinks that the internet is going to be destroyed if we use it too much. In fact, it's a network good. It becomes more valuable the more we use it. The commons analogy also suggests, problematically, that the internet is a single thing that can be governed in a single place by a single actor. This is an incredibly poor fit for reality, and as a mental model, it's going to leave us with a lot of problems. The final issue that I want to touch on from social science is not a shocking one. It's the idea that ability to conduct rulemaking is going to be compromised by deficits in legitimacy and trust. There are two such deficits, it seems to me. The first is that actors in this policy space have widely divergent expectations about legitimate procedural rules for dealing with internet issues at the global level. Here we have familiar divisions among states, what might be called an OECD view versus a Shanghai Cooperation Organization view versus a G77 view. But we also have two other sets of procedural views. One is corporate. It is based on private contract law, board accountability. The other is technologists, who rely on distributed, peer-produced, and consensus-based forms of rulemaking. The second legitimacy deficit, of course, comes from revelations about extensive state monitoring of online activity and communication by the Five Eyes, and also by China, among others. So faced with all of these problems, what does a Canadian strategy look like? How much time do I have, Roland? 7? Oh, good. I'm in excellent shape. All right. So I want to focus on two things. The first... Yeah, okay, all right. So the first is that we need to do much more learning. What I'm calling for here essentially is a major national priority level crash effort, much like we saw in the early nuclear period, as Jonai has argued, where we saw extensive efforts to bring policymakers into contact not only with military leaders, but especially and crucially with scientists. There's a great deal of learning about the social implications of new technology. We face as severe a challenge now with cyber as we did with nuclear, and it needs to be a priority on that scale. The good news, of course, is that social scientists work very cheaply. We work for peanuts. This won't be that expensive. It's crucial that this learning take place wherever possible and to the extent possible in advance of global rulemaking, though, and this means that we don't have a great deal of time. It's also crucial that these efforts at learning explicitly include a focus on governance. It's not simply enough to build new and better forms of material technology. We need to innovate on social technology and on governance and policy frameworks. This crash effort at learning can do several things for us. It can identify and, at least to some extent, remedy conceptual misunderstandings, like the misunderstanding the internet is a commons. It can also reduce uncertainty about the implications of new technology and about the interaction effects between new technologies and particular governance models. Other governments have already realized this. We're behind the curve. The United States Department of Defense Minerva initiative has examined cyber issues in great depth, continues to do so. In the United Kingdom, they've created a network of academic centers of excellence on cybersecurity research to facilitate a national conversation. So there are off-the-shelf models that we can draw on, and we should in order to catch up. Unlike the nuclear era, and unlike the nuclear learning that took place, however, given the low barriers to entry and the interconnected nature of the internet, it's important that this learning be as widely shared as possible instead of siloed and stovepiped within national policy contexts. And here, therefore, we have a role, I think, for the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, which has as part of its mission the convening of global expert networks on pressing issues. They could be asked to convene a network on these issues and should do so, I think. There's also a role for the International Development Research Center, which has done excellent work in the past on ICTs. And what the IDRC could do is disseminate the results of Canadian learning, first of all. Second of all, it could facilitate and coordinate genuinely shared exercises in learning that include experts from around the world. And third, it can make sure that Canada learns effectively from experience in fast growth markets. Kenya is an important example, but there are others. Kenya has been a leader in the development of mobile payment platforms and also was the birthplace of Ushahidi, which was used for election monitoring and has since been deployed in response to natural disasters as well. So there are some very important technologies that we can use and learn from the developing world. We do not have the monopoly in the developed world on this kind of information and learning any longer, if we ever really did. The second component of the Canadian strategy that I'd like to outline and talk about today is the need for a patient and flexible approach to rulemaking utilizing soft law instruments. I want to emphasize particularly that what we do not need now is a treaty. We do not know enough yet about this technology to sensibly create one. This soft law approach is a pragmatic approach consistent with the reality as well that rulemaking on the internet will remain decentralized for the foreseeable future. It will not happen in any one place, and thus we can't create a global overarching treaty. Soft law approaches also minimize transaction costs and renegotiation costs in making and interpreting social rules. and they have the flexibility to accommodate differences over legitimate procedure, especially in a low-trust environment in which we now find ourselves. Finally, and most important, a soft law approach buys time for learning, for what John Stuart Mill called experiments of living. And these experiments are precisely what we need for the foreseeable future on cyber and internet issues. The success of a soft law approach, though, and this is the point that I want to end on, rests on two key norms that Canada should do its absolute utmost to promote in every part of the international system where we can. The first is the obligation to do no harm, at least with respect to the global interoperability of the internet. This needs to be disseminated not only to other states, but also to other key players in industry and civil society. We must not damage the internet's global interoperability any more than it already is. Second, we need to inculcate a responsibility to cooperatively troubleshoot. Exactly as Canada pioneered the R2P, we should pioneer the idea that if a country or a company's actions or a civil society group's actions cause negative externalities for the global interoperability of the internet, then that actor, whoever it is, has the responsibility to troubleshoot it and to make the problem ameliorated or solved in some way. These norms should be seen as a foundation for safeguarding a well-functioning internet while we figure everything else out. Thank you.
So two really interesting, rich papers on the need for institutional innovation in a period of nonlinear change and uncertainty. Yves' paper deals with post-war multilateral institutions, and Mark's paper with the demand for institutional innovation for internet governance. And both highlight the importance of global rebalancing as a factor in the shift of power from the West to Asia and to the global South. And both papers also acknowledge, at least implicitly, that we're seeing some diffusion of power from states to non-state actors, and that we're living in a period of transition from hierarchies to networks. And when you talk about this, and there's a tendency sometimes to characterize this period of transition in a one-way direction, with all power flowing from the state to non-state actors. But I think it's interesting, in the case of internet governance, the transition may be more complicated. You have advanced industrial economies that have become accustomed to managing internet issues with the participation of large firms and trusted NGOs. Those people were in on the ground floor of the governance of the internet. But as other states become more interested, as they see the importance of the new technology, countries like Russia and China are more inclined to the view that states alone are competent to make international rules. And the situation is not dissimilar for post-colonial states that wish to preserve their sovereign privileges. So it's kind of the backlash, the reaction of the states. That's an interesting phenomenon. Both papers address the need for institutional innovation. In the case of Yves' paper on the multilateral institutions, these are seen as no longer being up to the task of dealing with global systemic risk and to reflect too much the values of those countries left standing at the end of the Second World War, and not reflecting enough the values and interests of the rest of the world. In the case of internet governance, the challenge is in understanding a relatively new area characterized by rapid technological evolution that is highly decentralized, and that will, as Mark pointed out, require not one set of rules, but a variety of rules for different purposes. And perhaps even more than the case of post-war institutions, the existence of several kinds of state and non-state actors with very different interests and very different cultures makes institutional innovation particularly daunting in this area. Neither paper is really explicit on the specific interests or values that Canada would advance in becoming involved in institutional innovation in these areas. Although, as Yves pointed out, engagement is an opportunity for Canada to upload its own values and its own networks. Both make the case for Canadian involvement. Mark's paper argues that Canada's universities have crucial human capital resources that should be leveraged in order to meet the emerging challenges. And as he pointed out, he sees roles for institutions like CFAR that has, as part of its network, cybersecurity, as part of its mandate, rather, cybersecurity, and could convene a global research network on that issue. And he also spoke of a role for IDRC, both in disseminating knowledge in the developing world and also ensuring that Canada learns from developing world experience. Yves asserts that as a mid-sized trading nation, we have an interest in upgrading the institutional infrastructure that sustains the global economy. He argues that Canada's human capital endowments would enable us to play a key innovative role in redesigning multilateral institutions and would also put Canada at the core of the future infrastructure of the global economy, which would be of benefit to Canadian business, to policymakers, and to universities. The papers are essentially, as Mark pointed out explicitly, advocating a learning agenda. It's more explicit in Mark's paper, but I think it's implied in Yves as well. And for me, I think this is really the key point, and I think it's been a theme that's come up in various other parts of this conference. At a time of significant global power shift, both horizontally and vertically, abetted by the emergence of transformational technologies and great uncertainty, we need a new approach to developing policy in on these issues. And more than ever, I would say, we need to build learning into the foreign policy agenda. So what would a learning approach look like? Some of the elements are in fact set out in the papers. Firstly, a learning approach would favor working with all Canadian stakeholders. Yves points out that effective foreign policy relies on leveraging partnerships between the public sector, the private sector, civil society, universities, and think tanks. Mark asserted that it's important that learning on internet governance be distributed as widely as possible, and he cites Joseph Nye's study and the parallel with the earlier nuclear period when programs were created specifically to foster dialogue between scientists, the military, and public officials to accelerate understanding in this area and ideally in advance of the development of international norms. Now, the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development has taken some early steps in this direction with its open policy approach, and that approach is based on 4 foundational principles. Firstly, breaking down stovepipes within the department. Secondly, leveraging the expertise, ideas, and resources of outside partners. Thirdly, engaging with non-governmental actors at the design stage of policy development. And fourthly, employing new collaborative technologies to do all of this. Secondly, I think a learning approach would recognize the need to deeply and proactively engage emerging powers. Some of this came out in this morning session, at some of the other sessions here as well. To do this, we basically need to sort of reconfirm the importance of basic diplomatic skills. We need to invest in understanding the history, the politics, the cultures, the traditions, the myths, and the realities that shape the thinking in other societies. We need to do this both to understand where their interests can be legitimately accommodated, but also to understand the degree of risk to our own interests and values. And finally, Mark advocated the use of soft law and informal rulemaking approaches as appropriate for internet governance. These approaches, as he says, are less binding than international treaties or other hard law approaches, so one of their benefits is that if they don't work, renegotiation costs are lower. They are quintessentially, I think, part of a learning strategy, especially where unexpected outcomes are a feature of dealing with novelty and complexity. You want to have a little bit of flexibility for how you're going to move forward and not be locked in prematurely before you actually understand what you're dealing with. So as a final comment, I'd note that the idea of taking a more collaborative, whole-of-country, patient, and piloting approach has resonance well beyond the 2 institutional innovation issues that are discussed in these papers. Globalization, the global power shift, the coexistence of hierarchies and networks, and the disruptive impact of technology are affecting all areas of governance. Everybody is struggling to understand these new dynamics. So adopting an active learning posture in the manner described in these papers, I think, is the only realistic option for Canada to face the future. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here and provide my comments to Yves and Mark's excellent papers. I'm going to start with Yves' paper on, hopeful paper, on Canada and global governance. He begins by describing the setting that we're in, and every speaker on every panel across this conference has basically described the tectonic shifts in the global landscape. The pecking order is changing for global power distribution. Non-state actors have more influence than ever before, and this is both benign influence and also malevolent influence. At the same time, we're seeing new transnational challenges, from infectious diseases to climate change. And through all this, we have our bedrock institutions, the ones created post-World War II. And so the question becomes for Yves is, how does Canada realize its interest against this backdrop? And I think you do a great job of sort of articulating the various risks that Canada faces. And you also propose a series of policy options, and I'm going to pick up on a few of those. I'm going to start off on the Group of 20. So here, Yves proposes to upgrade the institution, the Group of 20. And I would like to first start out by asking, what does this upgrade look like in terms of the architecture? Currently, in its current form, the G20 is a flexible institution. It has no secretariat. It has no secretary general. And so if we were to formalize it, would you be losing some of those efficiencies that are now current with that institution? The second is a question about performance. So I think we've all been in awe by the unprecedented cooperation and coordination of action in response to the financial crisis. But the truth of the matter is that over the past few years, the G20 has been losing some steam. And it's been losing its footing in terms of trying to figure out its place as a long-term steering committee versus a short-term crisis manager. There's also the question of legitimacy for the Group of 20. Yes, it's more legitimate than the Group of 7, but there are, as Anne-Marie Slaughter points out, still 173 UN member states who are not at the table. And this does matter when one thinks about the encroaching and expanding agenda of the G20. So whether it is heads of states using the Leader Summit to talk about Syria, whether it's the inclusion of climate change or the MDGs within the communiques, all these are issues that are relevant and pertain to the other UN member states. So this is not to say that Canada shouldn't engage in the G20, and the G20 is not a critical forum for Canada and its foreign policy posturing. But it's a cautionary note in terms of, is this the best venue to engage with emerging powers, first of all, and also on issues beyond global finance, international finance, and the global economy? Which also takes me to my next point, which is a comment on rising powers and engagement on rising powers. So you do offer a recommendation that we should increase the ambit of our engagement with rising powers, and yes, we do. And now I want to take this a step further, or a step back, actually, and think about where to engage with them. And here I want to look at our bedrock institutions once again. And we see that there are two sides to this relationship. At one end, yes, the UN Security Council, the Bretton Woods institutions, they're archaic, they're outdated. But at the same time, what we see is that rising powers want a shoe-in to these very institutions. So whether it's India or Brazil looking for permanent spots within the UN Security Council, whether it's Turkey or Indonesia having non-member status within the International Energy Agency, the World Bank chief economists being Chinese and now Indian, the list is long. And what it essentially tells us is that emerging powers are status quo powers. And this is to Canada's benefit. It can basically use the institution that it supports and participates in to engage emerging powers. Lastly, in terms of increasing Canada's partnerships in private-public ventures with civil society, non-state actors, I couldn't agree more. Canada needs, and sorry, I got a cold between yesterday and today. Canada needs an active foreign policy. And here I want to point out to an issue that was raised earlier this morning, which comes in your paper as well. It's the use of soft power. And you mention it in the broader sense, which I really appreciated. It's not just the use of development tools. It's not only trade, but it's also cultural exchanges, educational exchanges, and so forth. The one item that I thought was missing was the use of internet and the tools of the web. And I feel like this is an instrument that we should be using in the 21st century. So in particular, a secure and dynamic online strategy for diplomacy is one that I think could benefit Canada's influence. I'm going to move on to Mark's paper on internet governance. So here, I think this is a fairly difficult topic because it's a new dimension of foreign policy, and I think the international system is struggling in terms of finding its footing. So I do agree with Mark in saying that the ITU, under the auspices of the UN, is ill-equipped to address this challenge. And so what that takes us to is the multi-stakeholder model, which is what we have now, which Mark also calls out as the favored model. So that is good news in the sense that the UN is not functioning, and what it tells us is that intergovernmental bodies are not necessarily suitable for the internet. But I also want to examine this further in terms of, is the multi-stakeholder model the best for the future for the internet? And here, I worry about different actors who are used to functioning under different regimes, whether it's states who are used to top-down approaches, or whether it's states used to top-down approach. Sorry, I got the 1 minute mark. And a civil society which is used to bottom-up approaches. So we have to sort of realize that the different actors might be having some problems in terms of hierarchy, legitimacy, bargaining power, and so forth when we have this model. So the question for me becomes, to address flashpoints in cybersecurity, is this the ideal model as it stands for the future of internet? I thought your policy recommendations to spur learning was very fitting as we're trying to figure out what the correct model is for the internet. But here I thought the government also has a role to play. And one of the challenges I think there might be is to reach and integrate the netizens who are not in formal channels. So whether it is netizens in the developing South who are sort of don't have access to these formal channels, how to do that, how to integrate that. And I have one cautionary thought on that, which is when you look at the mega conferences of the UNFCCC, which has tried to integrate non-state actors, activists, and so forth, it leaves the civil society factions quite frustrated. So can the internet regime do a better job of bringing in, integrating these actors and sort of promoting the transparency that's needed? And I'll stop there.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to move to the question and answer period with our panelists, and I'm going to take the questions from here because microphone number 4 doesn't seem to be working. So, Farah, a short alert to you. But before we turn to you, I wanted to pose a question. Farah brought something up about netizens, which is the new concept of citizens online, and it just made me think, and it's really more of a cyber governance issue that Mark and Farah can answer. But I've been hearing things about this crazy idea of creating some kind of universal declaration of internet rights or a universal declaration of internet freedom. And I was wondering if either of you have anything to say about that, or if there are any members of the audience that would like to make comments. Who's going to be the first taker?
It's either good good news or bad news?
We need to know.
So the question was on internet rights? Is
About
that-
a universal declaration on internet rights or internet freedom.
I don't know about it.
So the view in, I think, most of the UN diplomatic human rights community has been that it's actually not necessary. The Human Rights Council has already passed a resolution articulating the principle that rights are technologically neutral and that there is no need to create new online rights because all of your normal human rights under the Universal Declaration, under the civil and political and economic and social covenants in particular, already apply online. So to some extent, having articulated that at the level of the Human Rights Council, as long as states pick that up and attempt to practice it, which of course is always the crucial question on human rights, then it may not actually necessary to create another new declaration.
Thank you. We're going to turn to the audience now. I'd ask you to please put up your hand, and there's people walking around with the microphones. Maybe first I'll go with a gentleman in the striped shirt. If you could please stand up and say your name and ask the question to the audience member you'd like to pose it to.
Yeah, thank you very much. I guess primarily a question for Mark to follow up on this idea of internet rights. This has been a fantastic panel. I think the challenge is it's such an important set of issues for the 21st century, but we're essentially talking about process. So if we were to look at it through the angle of substance, what are the actual issues or causes that we're trying to set rules about? This idea of some kind of a universal declaration of internet freedom might offer us an interesting direction. Perhaps from an international law perspective, there isn't the requirement because the law is relatively clear. But of course, international law isn't binding, and the threats exist regardless of whether the law is clear. One of the reasons why that idea caught my attention, and having worked on Iran issues and now on Venezuela issues, there is an interesting constellation of actors that care about internet rights that don't necessarily fall within the established camps of the international human rights movement or along the lines that we organize the world in with the West and the rest. There are some very strong domestic voices, advocates for internet rights. And one reason I think it might be an interesting area for Canadian foreign policy to explore is that not only would it allow us to pursue really very traditional goals of the international human rights, since they are more or less the same, but it would allow us to mobilize a much broader and really more unique, more innovative set of partners for expressing traditional Canadian goals in a much more 21st century format with 21st century partners and 21st century institutions. So I'd be interested to press them on this question of whether it's necessary or not. It might not be necessary international law, but is it not necessary in order to make sure that these rights actually get protected?
Before, Mark, you answer that one, I'd like to just maybe take questions in groups. A gentleman with the suit and the blue tie.
Great panel, thanks very much. Mark, I've got one for you, and I wonder if you'd comment on the conundrum that has bedeviled the international community's efforts with
Pardon me, sir, could you just introduce yourself?
John Adams from Queens. You mean you don't know me?
I'm sorry.
Just check.
My time at Queens was short.
Louise knows me. Okay.
He knows you.
Behave yourself. The issue that's bedeviled the international attempts at arriving at some form of governance, and it's the business of what the West would consider to be internet security versus what the authoritarian regimes would want, which they would call information security. For those of you that don't know, internet security would be secure software, hardware, and data storage. But for the authoritarian regimes, they want all of that, plus content security. And that seems to be a bedevilment that they haven't been able to handle. I welcome your comments on that.
And perhaps one more, perhaps not for Mark, but another member of the panel. Adam, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Adam Mosca. I'm a student here. Quick question. So I think Canada might have to make a decision pretty soon in terms of this phenomenon that we refer to as the Balkanization of the internet. The notion that Europe, for example, might create its own internet where it can secure its own version of internet rights within its own borders. And you might see the same thing. An example that Jared Cohen in his book talks about is Israel could, for example, have its own internet where the Orthodox establishment could decide what websites the people of Israel can look at. So these sorts of things. Canada will be pulled in different directions, especially if Europe goes in this direction. The US, of course, having a stance, no regulation on issues of expression, versus Europe might take, for example, Holocaust denial is something that they might regulate. So Canada is being pulled in different directions. Canada will eventually have to form a policy on this balkanization, and I'm wondering where the panel thinks Canada should go. Thank you.
Okay, there's 3 questions. I'll maybe, Mark, let you try to answer the first 2.
Okay, so the good news is having so many questions, I get to be really brief and dodgy on all of them. First, on the question of whether it might actually be necessary to create some kind of declaration politically, I still don't think so. Why not just articulate the principle that rights are technologically neutral and that all of our regular human rights already apply online? The devil, of course, is in figuring out how to apply that principle, right? And in particular, what to do when rights conflict. And the recent European Court of Justice decision is a terrific example because it establishes what's called the right to be forgotten, which means that as an individual, you can go to Google and say, pull all that nasty stuff about me offline. The problem is that tramples other people's right to free expression. We have conflicts between rights, so simply talking about rights doesn't solve our problems. It's always more complicated than that, and it's essentially a jurisprudential problem. And it will get worked out that way over time, I think, at least in large part. Mr. Adams, I suppose you're no longer reading my email, which is excellent, but please be gentle if you happen to remember anything. On internet versus information security, yeah, I mean, it's code, right? And countries talk in code all the time, and it sort of deals with what their interests are and what their agendas are. And I think the first step to dealing with that problem is being very aware of that distinction and what it means and what it entails. At the same time, I think that industrial democracies, and especially the Five Eyes, need to be exceedingly careful about throwing stones. We live in glass houses, and the distinctions on internet policy between authoritarian states and industrial democracies are not as sharp as we might like to believe that they are. In particular, the Cameron government in the UK is exploring and implementing a system to block adult content online in an opt-in fashion, which means, of course, that you will be required to tell your internet service provider, and by extension your government, that you would like guests to look at adult material online. That raises all kinds of implementation problems because it can lead to blocking of websites that are not, in fact, adult material and that deal with protection of children and protection of survivors of sexual assault and all kinds of other things. And they are discovering this and are trying to grapple with those problems. So I think we really need to avoid throwing stones while we live in glass houses. On balkanization of the internet, just a quick comment. I hate that word. I hate that frame. I think it is reasonable to talk about fragmentation of the internet, but of course the internet's already fragmented. Try logging into the New York Times website and reading more than 10 articles a month if you don't have a subscription. Try logging into Government of Canada websites and getting to secure places, right? There are all kinds of blocks on the internet already. Some of them are absolutely reasonable, right? And so this notion of the internet as this free and open commons, I think, is really misleading, and that's one of the points that I try to make in the paper.
Morris, I see you would like to say something.
I wanted to say something on the issue, sort of a little beyond the discussion on rights so far. You know, as you say, the rights already are codified. You know, they're technologically neutral in a sense. And I guess the problem is that, you know, whether it's rights that are being exercised, rights of expression that are, or assembly that are being exercised through the internet, or they're being exercised in real physical means, there are all sorts of places around the world where people can't exercise their rights, and there is, there's an extreme limitation on the ability of the international legal system to enforce those rights. They're really not enforceable. So I just one of those, sort of from a practical point of view, the question for us beyond rights is around technology and the access to two kinds of technology. One, circumvention technologies that actually enable people who want to express dissenting or dissident political views to be able to do that. And there are such technologies, and I think this is a kind of a race back and forth between those who would enable and those who would try and block. And then there are also the technologies that enable governments to determine who's trying, who's blogging, and who's using the internet in a way that is in opposition to authoritarian regimes. And there is a question as to whether and to what extent Western democratic countries ought to be enabling the provision of those technologies to authoritarian regimes. We already have export control regimes that deal with other sorts of strategic technologies. We should be looking at that as well. From the point of view, sort of beyond, simply looking at rights in the abstract, in terms of, the question is, what do we actually want to promote eventually, prematurely perhaps now in terms of ultimate rulemaking in these areas, but I think that we have a value set around democracy, freedom, the rule of law, freedom of expression, etc., that we can enable by, and as we have started to do in the department last year, and Ben was very involved in the exercise that we had with Monk in creating this global dialogue on human rights in Iran. So beyond the question of the formal expression of rights, there's a lot that we need to consider in order to promote rights in practice.
And Yves?
I had a larger point to add about the internet, and that there is a great paradox. And I wanted to ask a question, because when we focus about rights and access, we don't ask questions about the quality of information. And one thing that has really struck me is what I call the internet paradox, is how despite the real explosion of free information, how there are certain effects that take place, some mob effects, flash mob effects, some echo chambers effect, some crowding out effects, that in some places actually destroy public debate or quality information, or which is the basis for public debate or democracy. And the real striking moment for me was it was 2008, around the Beijing Olympics, as well as the China-Japan debates. If you study the information in China, or you study it in Japan, you find first that there's no difference between a democracy and a non-democracy. By any standard, looking at this, the majority of information in both cases is biased and is totally different. There's absolutely no understanding or improvement in mutual understanding. And the net outcome of those reinforcement effects, echo chamber effects, have been today a result where only 3% of Japanese trust the Chinese, and it's the same on the Chinese side. So we have to watch. I mean, that's a bigger question, right? What does it make? I know we asked the same question about universities. If you have 2/3 of the students in the class that are mostly tweeting and mostly, in their own communities of friends, what does it do to the debate within the class, right, at that moment? How can we balance the access to this immensity of information and speed, balance it with really quality, in-depth debates on complex issues? And I find some areas where it's breaking down, and I don't know what we can do about it. Maybe it's a maturity effect. We don't know yet how to deal with it. We're overwhelmed, and so people just get into circles and mob effect or reinforcement effects, and they ignore the rest. But.
And Farah, I know you wanted to say a few words.
Yeah, so on the question about the differences...
Farah, I don't think that microphone is working.
This is not working.
Yeah, please take number 3.
Can you guys hear me? Okay. So on the differences in perceptions for internet security, what that does highlight is the difference in lexicon that's used across the world for terms in internet, which shows how difficult this space is for policymakers, and why working throughout issues related to cybersecurity, from espionage to the broader issues of cybercrime, whether you're engaging Interpol or even cyber warfare, it's difficult within the auspices of the UN, precisely because of the differences in ideation of the technical aspects, but also where you want the internet to go amongst the different regions of the world. So just to highlight that institutional landscape.
Thank you. We'll go with the next round of questions. Who would like to, gentleman, the blue blazer and the white shirt? The microphone is coming. Please stand up and introduce yourself, please.
Jean-Pierre Chabot with the GOPAC. Just in terms of a network that comes to mind in terms of security issues is human trafficking networks. My question would be simply, to what extent are we over-reliant on the internet and such infrastructures when we look at the interaction between institutions and these such networks?
Thank you. Anybody else would like to? Aren't that many technically minded people out there right today? Okay, who would like to take the question about we're over-reliance on the internet?
I can, but I don't want to suck up all the oxygen.
Someone needs to answer.
I've been working on internet governance issues for about a year and a half at CG, and I tell people, the more I learn about the internet, the less I want to use it. I think that there are real questions here, and perhaps the most dangerous case of over-reliance that I can think of is financial markets and financial networks. The question is, if the internet were to disappear tomorrow, who could operate a stock exchange the old-fashioned way? The burnout rate in that profession is so high that the lack of pre-internet age knowledge is striking. I mean, we would almost be unable to do it. And as we continue to develop the internet and integrate it with more and more modern systems, this problem is only going to be compounded. Now, the good news is the internet's incredibly resilient and was built to, be that way. But by the same token, yeah, there are real questions about whether we are overly reliant on it. Unfortunately, as I tried to highlight, I don't think that technological innovation is a trend that's susceptible to policy initiatives. So I don't think there's anything we can do about that. It's a case of adapting and dealing with it.
Thank you. Anybody else? Another question, lady in the white blazer.
Hi, my name is Giovanna Mingarelli. I am the co-founder of a mobile tech startup, MC2, which tracks, maps, and verifies people's daily activities. I've been listening very intently to the panel. It's been fascinating so far. I actually just came from Washington a day and a half ago, where I attended a conversation, public-private conversation between the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Councils on big data, catastrophic risk, and the future of the internet, and UN OCHO. And the discussion was about big data and how big data can be used in helping to solve a lot of the world's problems, in particular during crisis situations, but as well looking at some of the institutional implications that we're talking about today. And my question is this. Governor Tom Ridge, who used to be the head of Homeland Security under President Bush, was the keynote speaker of the event at the beginning of the day. And one of his main points was, with the prevalence of big data as we see it, and the fact that data isn't actually going anywhere, we're only getting more and more of it every day, how can we actually make that data actionable? Right, so Yves, you spoke of the nature of the interpretation of data and how that plays a role in our ability to manipulate it and make sense of it. But in this context, how can we actually take the information and the data that is being produced across various networks, across the institutions that we're developing, across social networks, and how can we turn that into real-world action that can actually help infuse and benefit the conversations that we're having, both within Canada and abroad? I open it to the panel, if anyone has any thoughts on that.
Who's the brave soul of our panel? Farah.
So, at CFR, we have a partnership with Google and Google Ideas. So that's the Think Do arm of Google. And we precisely look at this. We look at how Google, which has access to so much data, can actually use the data to do things like counterterrorism or fight criminal activities. So if the question is how how can we use big data to make it actionable and to solve world crises? I think it's precisely these flexible partnerships, this innovation that you need to figure out together how to make it actionable.
Yes, Yves.
I can add something. Maybe a key principle is to know when we can use big data in optimization way and when we cannot, right? So, and we're learning that. So sometimes if we try to use it in situations where we cannot, then we're in trouble. But obviously it's best used in cases of cost-benefit analysis, optimization, or where we need to gather a lot of systematic information to be able to analyze the lay of the land. It may not give you all the solutions afterwards, so there are several steps, but it will make us more powerful in analyzing the problems. I would add, however, that we tend today to be overly rational about it. And for someone like me, we spend most of the time in Asia. In the end, you won't have a true cooperative effort or a true problem-solving moment, say, with Chinese counterparts, until first you spend time around the table, eating together, building trust, building human relations. So that's the cautionary side. We will not solve big issues in the world or have major innovation in institution or solve our gap in governance, right, without a lot of time spent on human understanding. And that's, again, the irony that the more data we have, the more information, the more technology we have, the less, or at least the less we progress in cross-cultural understanding. And that remains a core obstacle to a lot of things today.
Morris.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a sort of a slight cautionary note on big data, and I agree. This is going to you're working with partnerships, and Google, is one of the organizations that's generating an awful lot of data. There was a story recently about the phenomenon of using Google searches to anticipate the beginning of flu epidemics or other public health problems. But the article I saw suggested that it may actually lead to some false positive situations. So one of the questions I have is whether we actually understand what we're getting with big data, and whether this also goes to a question of literacy. As part of the learning agenda, I think there's going to have to be in all areas of policy for all the actors much more literacy and understanding of what you actually have and what it can do. And one of the things I worry about is sort of treating this a little bit as kind of the flavor of the month or the flavor of the era, and as an excuse to throw away more traditional sources of data. I mean, there's been a huge debate in Canada over the past few years around the elimination of the long-form census, with some of the argumentation being, well, what do you need that for anymore? You can just, get all of the data that you need by looking at the internet. I don't think that that's necessarily the case, and I think that we need to be very discerning on what big data can do and understanding what it can do, and not be so quick to get rid of some of our traditional sources. I think this is an example of kind of the shift and probably quite a long period of transition of the coexistence of traditional data sources as we begin to learn the potential of new sources and really understand what they can do for us.
We're drawing near an end, so I might ask our panel members if there's any closing comments or statements they would like to make that wasn't covered in the original presentation. We'll start with you, Yves.
I had a few points I had to make about the G20, because today it looks like the G20 is this, in decline, as mentioned by Farah, or doesn't have the potential that it looked like it had. In fact, it's a lot more fluid and plastic than anyone realizes. It's the tip of an iceberg, as my friend Alan Alexandrov loves to say. There are meetings all year long, working groups, ministerial meetings 6 times for the finance ministers, and it's the best shot we have at a true dialogue between emerging powers networks and established networks. We don't have any alternative to it today, right? That where there's a trusting discussion, say on banking or on capital control between the Chinese, the Brazilians, and the Canadians and the Americans. We have no alternative to this. And the more, so some of the deeper thing is the more we try to rely on the G7, the more we spur the emerging markets to come together and have a BRICS bank, right? The G20 has the potential to break those fake. Today we're still in a fluid moment where the boundaries are still fluid, and therefore where, in a way, the opposition between, say, BRICS and G7 is still not real. It's still fake. We can still transcend it with a tool like this. The institutionalization of it, there's always that very repetitive debate, if you have a secretariat, will it decrease the flexibility? We can go way beyond this, right? A secretariat can be very small, very nimble, very flexible. All it does is it can accumulate historical data, and it can provide ideas, and it can be shaped in a way that is totally owned by the different, that it has inputs from all sources. It doesn't have to have any impact on flexibility. It's more a statement about the potential of the G20. And the debate about the Secretariat has nothing to do with flexibility in reality. It's about those who see a future in the G20 and those who don't, who prefer to rely on states. So when we look inside, China is in favor of it, Korea is in favor of it, the US is opposed to it today. It's roughly 12-8, right? But there is, there's a lot more potential than it looks like. The legitimacy question is also not real in the sense that already you have actually 25 members there, plus 6 or 7 organizations. Of the 25, you have ASEAN, you have the African Unity, Organization of African Unity, you have the EU. So in fact, you have nearly half the world there already. And even for climate, the top 10 emitters represent 80% of emissions. If you have a way to do cross-issue linkages between climate and trade and other things, and can nudge them to go faster, this is very useful. And that's the problem today of the UNFCCC. We cannot do cross-issue linkages with other things. Only in a forum like the G20, you could do cross-issue linkages. So we can be flexible about it, and the potential is enormous.
We are just a few last very short closing comments. Thank you.
Right. So the thing I want to leave everyone with is the idea of an internet governance and cybersecurity moonshot. I think we really need to think about that idea. And while government has a role, we need to wait maybe for that to happen. And I'm not going to pass up the opportunity sitting beside the new incoming head of the Trudeau Foundation to suggest that maybe there's a role for foundations here too.
Smart. Morris, you're okay? Yeah. Well, I want to thank you all for joining us on this panel. Please thank you. And now I'd like to call Bill Graham up to start theme session number 11. Thank you.